Welcome to Crime of Slaves. Before we start tonight's episode, take a brief moment and let us know in the comment section where you are tuning in from. Your city, your country, the time that surrounds you at this very moment. We go through every single comment. We notice you from Lagos and London, from Atlanta and Amsterdam, from Kingston and Kuala Lumpur. And each time a comment is left, it signals to us that these overlooked voices are at last receiving a hearing. If you haven't yet subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please do so right now. Activate all notifications because the narrative you are about to encounter represents the kind of history that never made it into textbooks, was never part of any school curriculum, and was never discussed in respectable circles. It was deliberately entered, cloaked in hush, and secured behind the barriers of plantation residences where influential men believed their secrets would stay eternally concealed. They were mistaken. The tale we are going to relate to you this evening is not an easy one. It was never intended to be. It concerns what transpired when the carriages came rolling down the lengthy, unpaved roads of the American South. When the noise of horses and merriment reached the ears of enslaved women laboring inside those magnificent, dreadful homes. It is a story about their knowledge, their fears, their ordeals, and what they silently bore for the remainder of their days. Get comfortable. Eliminate every interruption, and pay close attention, because these women merit, at the very minimum, the chance to finally be heard. There exists a specific noise that recurs repeatedly in the accounts of formerly enslaved women who toiled inside the grand plantation residences of the American South. It isn't the crack of the overseer's lash, though that noise appears frequently enough. It isn't the clang of iron shackles, nor the auctioneer's shout calling out prices above the heads of human beings arranged in a courthouse yard. The sound that emerges most often, recalled with the greatest clarity, remembered with the most exact emotional significance, is the noise of carriage wheels upon a dirt road. The distant rumble, the rhythmic beat of wooden wheels turning over compacted earth, growing louder as the vehicle neared, sometimes joined by the sound of horses exhaling, or the voices of men laughing at some private jest shared during the trip. That sound to the women who labored inside those houses was not merely the signal of guests arriving. It was a caution. It signified that the evening ahead would diverge from other evenings. It indicated that the careful terrain of peril that those women maneuvered every single day, every hour of each day, had just shifted in the most threatening manner possible. It implied that men they did not recognize, men who possessed the complete authority of a society structured to safeguard their pleasures and justify their transgressions, would soon be within the same walls where those women toiled, ate, and attempted to rest. It implied that before the night concluded, some of them would be directed into rooms they did not wish to enter. And that refusal was not an option that the world they inhabited had reserved for them. This is the narrative of those women, of what they bore inside the plantation residences of Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas. Of the testimonies they ultimately gave when the chains of slavery were shattered, and they were at last tentatively free to speak. Of what those testimonies reveal to us about the essence of absolute power, the specific susceptibility of black women in pre-Civil War America, and the profound moral collapse of a society that constructed its prosperity and its culture upon the methodical violation of human dignity. This is a story that history tried to obliterate. Tonight on Shadows of Black History, we restore it. To comprehend what occurred inside the plantation houses of the American South, you must first grasp what those houses were built to symbolize and what they were intended to hide. The grand plantation homes that dominated the southern terrain from the late 17th century through the Civil War were architectural declarations of authority. They were constructed to be observed. Broad porches facing the roadway, tall pillars reaching toward second-floor verandas, symmetrical frontages painted brilliant white, visible for miles across level cotton fields, and above the tops of sugarcane and tobacco. From a distance, they conveyed everything their owners wished to communicate to the world: wealth, order, civilization, endurance. Travelers approaching these houses for the first time often spoke of a feeling of magnificence. The long avenue of oak trees leading to the front entrance, the formal gardens arranged with geometric exactness, the sound of music, sometimes drifting from parlor windows during the social season. If those travelers had come by invitation, they would be received at the door by a house servant, usually a woman, dressed in the neat clothing that plantation owners required their domestic staff to wear as a symbol of their own refinement. Everything visible was intended to reinforce a singular narrative. This is a place of grace. This is a place of cultivation. This is the utmost expression of Southern civilization. What that narrative required concealing was the world that actually rendered it possible. Behind the beautiful house lay the slave quarters, sometimes 100 yards distant, sometimes within sight of the kitchen windows. Low wooden structures with earthen floors and shared walls housing dozens of human beings who possessed no legal rights, no freedom of movement, no protection under statute, and no chance of refusal when their owners will contradicted their own survival. The men and women who resided in those quarters woke before dawn, worked until after dark, and returned to those structures exhausted beyond description, night after night, season after season, year after year. But among all the enslaved individuals on a plantation, the women who worked inside the house occupied a position of particular and frequently misunderstood fragility. Historians and popular narratives about slavery have occasionally proposed that house servants had it easier than field workers. They were sheltered from the sun. They worked under a roof. They sometimes wore better clothing and ate more varied food. All of this was accurate and almost entirely irrelevant to the point. What it obscured was the specific danger that proximity to the plantation owner and his household created for enslaved women who worked within those walls. Proximity meant visibility. Visibility meant selection. And selection in the world of the pre-Civil War South could signify many things, almost none of them to the benefit of the woman who had been chosen. The women who prepared the elaborate dinners. The women who cleaned the guest rooms, turned down the beds, and laid out the fresh linens. The women who transported candles down the darkened hallways. Late at night, these women understood their world with a precision and a clarity that no official document of the period ever fully captured. They understood the distinction between the plantation house as it appeared to visitors and the plantation house as it actually functioned. And when those visitors arrived, they perceived the difference in every nerve of their bodies. The world those women navigated was governed by a legal and social structure that had been constructed with extraordinary care to shield the powerful and leave the powerless exposed. Under American slavery law, enslaved people were legally property, not persons' property. The implications of this classification were absolute. An enslaved woman had no legal right to refuse any directive from her owner. She had no legal recourse against any form of mistreatment. She could not lodge a complaint, pursue legal action, testify in court against a white person, or appeal to any authority for protection. Her body, her labor, her time, and her person existed entirely at the discretion of the man who owned her. This was not a loophole or a defect in the system. It was the system, and within that system, the arrival of guests at the plantation house carried implications that every enslaved woman inside those walls understood with absolute clarity. Among the voices that survived the deliberate forgetfulness of the pre-Civil War era, one voice stands above the rest in its lucidity, its bravery, and its refusal to allow polite society to pretend that what happened inside those plantation houses did not happen. Her name was Harriet Jacobs. She was born in 1813 in Edon, North Carolina, into a world that had already determined her worth in the most reductive possible terms. She was property. She was, in the language of the era, a slave girl. What Harriet Jacobs became through years of suffering, defiance, and extraordinary intellectual courage was something that the world around her had never intended for her. She became a witness, she became a writer, and she became, through her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, one of the most significant voices in the entire history of American literature. Not because of her literary style, though that was exceptional, but because of what she was prepared to articulate. She was prepared to articulate what others wished her to keep quiet. She was ready to describe in language that she knew would startle and discomfit the predominantly white northern middle class women. She was addressing the specific sexual perils that enslaved women encountered within plantation households. She was willing to identify with a precision that left no comfortable vagueness the connection between the institution of slavery and the exploitation of enslaved women's bodies as a routine element, not an anomaly of plantation existence. Jacobs recounted her own situation beginning when she was around 15 years old. Her enslaver, whom she called Dr. Flint in the narrative to shield herself legally, initiated a campaign of harassment, control, and coercion that would persist for years. He whispered things to her in the kitchen. He left notes. He spoke to her when no one else could overhear. He did not initially resort to direct violence, because the nature of total power does not always require direct violence. It can function through the constant menace of violence, through the manipulation of every relationship a person holds dear, through the use of the enslaved person's love for their children, their family, their small community, as a lever to secure compliance. But what Jacobs described in her narrative extended far beyond her personal experience. She documented the architecture of peril that all enslaved women in house service navigated. She depicted the moment when visitors arrived at the plantation house, and the transformation that came over the enslaved women who worked there. The careful attention to which woman might be chosen, the commands that were given after dinner, when the guests were settled, and the candles were burning low, the young women who walked toward the guest rooms and returned hours later, silent. She wrote about the way the mistress of the plantation responded to these events, the jealousy, the cruelty, the punishment of enslaved women for their own victimization. The mistress who knew what her husband was doing and turned her fury not on her husband, whom she could not control, but on the enslaved women whom she could. This dynamic, Jacobs wrote, was one of the most insidious features of slavery's corruption of the white household. The system generated both the offense and then redirected the reaction to the offense onto its most powerless victims. Jacobs eventually selected a strategy of defiance so daring and so painful that it is almost unbearable to contemplate. She concealed herself for 7 years. She lived in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house, a space so small she could not stand upright, barely 3 feet high at its tallest point, baking in summer, freezing in winter, lying still for months at a time, while her children lived below her and did not know she was there. 7 years in that space, so that the man who owned her could not reach her. 7 years because the only freedom available to her was a darkness so complete that it amounted to a burial before death. When she finally emerged and eventually reached the North, when she finally recorded what she had witnessed and experienced, she prefaced her account with an apology that says everything about the world she was navigating. She wrote that she was aware that some would think she was describing things that should not be spoken aloud. She wrote that she was not without pride, but she wrote that the truth required telling, and that silence was the only thing the perpetrators of these crimes actually wanted from their victims. She refused to grant it to them. Harriet Jacobs was a writer. She was educated in defiance of the laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. She possessed both the language and the courage to set down her experience in a form that could reach the public. But the overwhelming majority of the women who shared her experience had neither literacy nor platform. Their stories existed only in the architecture of memory held inside them through the decades that followed emancipation, carried through lives of continued poverty and marginalization, until age began its final work. By the 1930s, many of the last living survivors of American slavery were dying. They were old. Some were in their 70s. Others were in their 80s or 90s. They had been children when the Civil War ended, and they had carried inside them for 70 years memories of a world that most of their grandchildren could barely imagine. The Federal Writers Project, an initiative of the New Deal era, dispatched interviewers across the former Confederate states to record the testimonies of these men and women before those testimonies disappeared forever. The project eventually collected more than 2,000 narratives from formerly enslaved individuals across 17 states. It represents one of the most extraordinary archives in the history of American letters. It is also one of the most heartbreaking, because reading through those narratives is to understand in the most direct and unmediated way possible what slavery actually was. Not slavery as an abstraction, not slavery as an economic system described in ledger books. Slavery as it was lived day by day and night by night by the men and women who had no choice but to live it. And among the testimonies collected by the Federal Writers Project, the subject of what happened when guests arrived at the Plantation House appears with a frequency and a consistency that cannot be explained as coincidence or individual aberration. It appears because it was not individual. It was systemic. It was a feature, not a flaw, of the way plantation hospitality operated. An elderly woman from Louisiana, interviewed in the late 1930s, recalled a young housemaid she had known when she was a child on the plantation where they both lived. She described the girl as quiet, hardworking, careful. She described how the girl had been assigned to the upstairs guest rooms, and how, whenever important men stayed overnight at the plantation house, the girl was sent to their rooms in the evening with candles and wine. The woman who told this story was in her late 80s when she spoke. More than 70 years had passed since slavery ended. She remembered the girl's face when she returned from those rooms. She remembered the way she sat alone in the servant quarters, long after midnight, crying quietly. She remembered how no one spoke about it the next morning. They all went back to their work and pretended that nothing had happened. What that testimony captures with an economy and a precision that no academic analysis can improve upon is the specific moral structure of the plantation world. It was a world in which everyone knew. The enslaved people knew. The mistress often knew. The children of the household sometimes knew. The neighbors who visited knew, and the shared communal decision not to speak, not to name, not to acknowledge was not innocence. It was the active maintenance of a fiction that the entire society required to function. Another testimony from a man interviewed in Mississippi described the gambling nights that neighboring plantation owners organized on the estate where he had lived as a child. He had been a boy during slavery, old enough to observe, but not yet old enough to fully understand everything he saw. What he remembered most clearly, he said, was the sound of the men drinking late into the night, and the quiet way the housemaids moved through the house, serving food and refilling glasses, and the way those same women looked the next morning when he saw them beginning their chores in the kitchen. They never spoke about what had happened during the night, but even as a child, he understood that something had happened, something that the world he lived in had decided was normal. Across the rolling countryside of Virginia, where tobacco had built generations of plantation wealth, and the rivers ran wide and slow between banks dense with oak and cypress, the plantation gathering was a cornerstone of white social life. Men who spent their working days managing enslaved labor, negotiating crop prices, and maintaining the elaborate machinery of the slave economy needed recreation. They found it in each other's company. The gatherings varied in their scale and their pretensions. Some were formal dinners staged with the full theatrical apparatus of white linen tablecloths, silver candlesticks, and elaborate food prepared by enslaved cooks who worked through the afternoon and into the night to produce meals whose names appeared in French on handwritten menu cards. Others were less formal. A group of neighboring plantation owners arriving on horseback, the horses tied at the post near the front porch, the men bringing their own whiskey and their own cards and settling in for an evening of gambling that might last until 2 or 3 in the morning. What both types of gathering had in common, beneath their surface differences of formality and scale, was the presence of enslaved women moving through the rooms, carrying food and drink, clearing plates, keeping the candles burning, and existing in the minds of the men they served as part of the ambient environment of the plantation house. Not people to be attended to, but features of the setting, furniture that moved. This perception, this deliberate reduction of human beings to their instrumental functions was not incidental to what happened during these nights. It was prerequisite. It was the mental operation that made possible the orders given after the gambling ended, and the bottles were empty, and the men prepared to move to their rooms. To order a person into a room for the purpose of exploitation requires first having convinced yourself, or at least performed the convincing, that what you are ordering is not a person, but a thing. The language of slavery provided the vocabulary for exactly this performance. Property, servant, girl, never woman. The testimonies from Virginia plantations describe a pattern with a consistency that speaks to how widespread the practice was. A group of men gathering, drinking that grew heavier as the evening progressed. Card games that generated the particular emotional volatility of gambling. And then, when the games ended, and the money had changed hands, and the men were drunk enough to feel invulnerable, and sober enough to still issue coherent instructions, the orders that the enslaved women in the house had been dreading since they first heard the carriages rolling up the drive. The orders were never delivered with anger. Testimony after testimony makes this point, and it is worth sitting with, because it reveals something important about the psychology of the men giving them. The orders were delivered calmly, sometimes almost apologetically, in the way that a person might apologize for a minor inconvenience they are causing to another. Send one of the girls to the guest rooms. Make sure the gentlemen are comfortable tonight. The casual register, the domestic vocabulary, the performance of normally, all of it designed to encode the intolerable as routine. For the women who received those orders, There was no confusion about what was being asked. There was no ambiguity to navigate. There was only the calculation of survival. What happens if I refuse? What happens to my children if I refuse? What happens to the woman who shares my quarters, my food, my small daily existence? If my refusal makes the master angry tonight, slavery operated through exactly these calculations. It did not require constant violence, because the threat of violence, ever-present and omnidirectional, did most of the work. The woman who walked slowly down the hallway toward the guest room was not submitting to the desire of the man waiting behind that door. She was submitting to the entire weight of a society, constructed to give her no other viable option. And when she returned before dawn to take up her work again, there was no acknowledgement, no comfort offered by the master or his family, no recognition that anything unusual had occurred. The performance of normally continued into the morning, as if the night had not happened, as if she had not happened. Part 6. The Overseer's Dominion, Mississippi and the Chain of Command. Mississippi Chapter. If the plantation owner represented one stratum of the threat that enslaved women navigated, the overseer represented another, and in some ways more immediate one. The plantation owner was the ultimate authority. But he was not always present. He might have business in town. He might be traveling. He might spend weeks away from the estate, while his crops were tended, and his workers managed by the man he had hired to do his daily enforcement. The overseer was that man. And in the hierarchy of the plantation world, the overseer occupied a position that was in some respects the most psychologically complex of any player in the slave economy. He was not wealthy. He did not own the land or the people working it. He was himself a laborer, hired labor, paid a wage to maintain a system from which he benefited only indirectly. Yet he wielded within the borders of the plantation a near total authority over the lives of dozens or hundreds of human beings. He could punish. He could restrict. He could assign the hardest work in the worst conditions. And he could, if the owner was absent or indifferent or complicit, extend that authority into domains that had nothing to do with cotton production. The Mississippi testimony collected by the Federal Writers Project from a formerly enslaved cook who had worked on a large cotton plantation describes an overseer whose character embodies everything that the concentration of unchecked power does to the men who hold it. He was known for cruelty long before his parties began. He had established his reputation through the particular directness of his punishments in the cotton fields, a kind of theatrical brutality designed to communicate to everyone watching that his authority had no limits, and that challenging it would produce consequences severe enough to function as a permanent lesson. But the cruelty of the daytime fields was, in a sense, the public performance of his power. The gatherings he began hosting on weekend evenings were something different. They were the private expression of it. He invited other overseers from neighboring plantations. He invited traders passing through the region. He invited men whose position in the colonial hierarchy of the plantation world was similar to his own, men with authority, but without wealth. Men who found in these gatherings a temporary confirmation that their power over others was real and absolute. The enslaved cook who described these nights had watched them unfold many times. She had carried food to the table where the men drank and shouted stories. She had refilled glasses and cleared plates, while keeping her eyes directed toward the floor, understanding that visibility invited attention, and that attention in the atmosphere of those nights was never safe. She had listened to the progression of the drinking, and the progression of the men's behavior louder and more reckless as the whiskey moved through them until the inevitable moment when the overseer rose from his chair and issued the instructions that every person in the servant quarters had been waiting for with dread. Send the girls. Make sure our guests are satisfied. The cook described one particular young woman who had arrived on the plantation only a few years earlier, sold from another estate. Separated from everyone she knew, navigating a world that had stripped her of every familiar anchor. The older women on the plantation had tried to protect her in the ways available to them, which were small ways, meaningful ways, the kind that keep people alive inside situations that might otherwise destroy them entirely. They had placed her close to them in the work rotation. They had warned her about the overseer's parties. They had tried to create a kind of distributed shield around her made of presence and proximity. But the overseer's order could not be deflected by presence and proximity. When her name was given one evening, she walked down the hallway, with trembling hands carrying a small tray, and the women in the kitchen heard the door close at the end of the hall, and they waited. They had learned to wait. And when she returned before sunrise, looking the way that women returning from those rooms always looked, the cook placed a hand briefly on her arm. There were no words. Words would have been inadequate to the weight of what had happened. There was only the acknowledgement of witness, the confirmation that someone had seen, and that seeing, even in silence, was a form of resistance available to them when no other form was. The plantation record books of that era contain no mention of these events. They record the weight of cotton bales, the number of field hands, the purchase prices of enslaved people, the cost of medical attention and equipment. They do not record what happened in the plantation house when the overseer's guests arrived, because the men keeping those records had decided, as a matter of conscious policy, that these events did not require recording, that they were not events at all, that they were simply part of the ambient operation of a system that was, in their understanding, working exactly as designed. Names matter. The names that people give to places and things carry within them. The concentrated weight of experience that official language has declined to record. In the formal vocabulary of the plantation house, every room had a function and a designation drawn from the architecture of white domestic life. Guest rooms, parlors, drawing rooms, dining rooms, the language of comfort and hospitality. But the enslaved people who moved through those rooms, who cleaned them and tended them and occupied them under circumstances that bore no relationship to comfort or hospitality, developed their own names for the spaces that mattered most in their lives. And on a plantation located in the low coastal country of South Carolina, where rice paddies spread across the wetlands, and the heavy air carried the smell of river water and marsh grass year-round, the enslaved workers gave one room a name that has endured through the testimonies collected long after slavery ended. They called it the guest room of sorrow. The name was not spoken to white people. It passed through the servant quarters in whispers, communicated from older workers to newer arrivals as one of the essential pieces of information required to survive on that particular plantation. It was delivered the way all critical knowledge was delivered in the slave community, through the quiet, precise top-person transmission of intelligence that the people at the top of the plantation hierarchy never fully understood was happening, because they had decided that the people doing it were not intelligent enough to be worth understanding. The room itself was not distinctive in appearance. A bed, furniture suited to a guest's comfort, a window facing the direction from which visitors arrived, so that the approaching carriage could be seen from inside the room, a place where traveling businessmen rested, where neighboring plantation owners stayed during multi-day visits, where doctors and lawyers and traders slept on their journeys through the region. A room, like many others in many houses across the South, which is precisely the point. What made it the room of sorrow was not its physical characteristics. What made it the room of sorrow was the pattern of what happened in it. An elderly man who had grown up on that plantation, interviewed by the Federal Writers Project when he was in his 80s, described the routine with a specificity that suggests the pattern had been established so firmly, repeated so reliably that every person on the plantation knew it, as well as they knew the rhythm of the workday. When visitors arrived, the household was mobilized. Rooms were prepared, food was cooked, the formal machinery of plantation hospitality was activated. After dinner, when the conversation between the plantation owner and his guests had concluded, and the whiskey bottles were brought out, the evening moved into its later phase. The house grew quieter. Servants finished their work in the kitchen and the dining room. The last plates were cleared, the last glasses refilled, and then, in the voice of the plantation owner, came the instructions that transformed the guest room of sorrow from a room into a sentence. One of the girls would be chosen. The choice varied, the man explained. Sometimes it was based on who the visiting guest had looked at during dinner. Sometimes it seemed to have no logic the enslaved people could identify, but the result was always the same. A young woman carrying a candle, walking the length of the hallway toward the room at the front of the house, the door closing behind her. The rest of the house settling into the performance of sleep. The elderly man described watching this process as a boy. He said he could not at first understand the full weight of what he was seeing. He saw the women walk to the room. He saw them return in the morning. He saw the expression on their faces, or more precisely, the deliberate absence of expression, the practiced blankness that enslaved people learned to maintain over anything they needed to protect. He said he eventually understood, as he grew older, that the blankness was not absence of feeling. It was the membrane between interior reality and the hostile exterior world. It was the face that said nothing while the person behind it continued to exist, continued to feel, continued to carry the full weight of what had been done to them by a system that counted their silence as their consent. One woman, who had herself been a housemaid on that plantation, described something that the man's testimony did not capture. She described what the older servants told the younger ones when they first arrived, the quiet transmission of knowledge that was both warning and preparation, and an inadequate substitute for the protection that should have existed and did not. Stay close to the kitchen. Keep your head down when the visitors come. Do not catch anyone's eye at dinner. Move quickly through the hallways and do not linger. None of it was enough. She knew that now, she said, speaking from the distance of decades. None of the warnings and strategies and small acts of navigation that the older women shared with the younger ones were enough to protect them from the fundamental reality of their position. What those strategies could do, and what they did do, was communicate something essential. You are not alone. We see what is happening to you. We cannot stop it. But we are here, and when you return, we will still be here. And that is what we have to offer in a world that has taken everything else. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the way the plantation economy used the physical appearance of enslaved women, and it requires careful examination because it reveals something about the specific mechanics of exploitation that the more general narrative of slavery sometimes obscures. In the cotton fields of Georgia and the surrounding states, physical labor was the primary currency of exploitation. An enslaved person's value was measured in their capacity for sustained agricultural work, in the weight of cotton they could pick, in the acres they could prepare, in the hours of labor that could be extracted from their bodies before those bodies gave out. In this calculus, appearance was irrelevant. What mattered was endurance. But inside the plantation house, a different calculus operated. And within that different calculus, the physical appearance of enslaved women became a form of vulnerability that added another dimension of danger to their already dangerous position. To be considered attractive in the eyes of the plantation owner and his guests was not an advantage. It was an exposure. It meant being more frequently selected. It meant being placed in closer proximity to the men who visited the house. It meant being watched with an attention that was not admiring but predatory, not flattering but threatening. The woman who shared the testimony, recorded in the Federal Writers Project from Georgia, had been sold at auction as a young girl, separated from her mother in the transaction that most enslaved people identified as the single most traumatic event of their lives. She remembered the auction yard with the particular vividness that extreme fear imprints on memory, the crowd of buyers moving among the people lined up for inspection, the hands that examined bodies for signs of strength or illness. The moment her mother was sold to, a buyer moving in a different direction, and the impossibility of that separation, the way it unmade the only stable structure her childhood had contained. She was purchased by a plantation owner who brought her to his estate and assigned her to the house rather than the fields. She understood, when this happened, that she was receiving something that other young women on the plantation had not received. She did not yet understand what the assignment would cost her. The pattern revealed itself gradually: the visits from neighboring planters, the dinners, the way certain men watched her as she moved through the rooms serving food. The instruction from the plantation owner delivered one evening in the quiet hallway with the same casual authority that characterized all such instructions: that she should bring candles to the guest room and make sure the visitor was comfortable through the night. She described the walk down the hallway with a specificity that suggests she had replayed it in her memory many times over the following years. The sound of her own footsteps on the wooden floor, the flickering of the candle she carried, the voices behind her in the dining room growing fainter as she approached the door, the knock, the entry, the closing of the door behind her. What she endured in that room and in the many rooms that followed over the years of her service in the plantation house, she described only obliquely in her testimony. This obliqueness was common in the Federal Writers Project narratives, not because the interviewees were confused about what had happened to them, but because the interviewers were white, often Southern, and the women being interviewed had spent their entire lives learning to calibrate how much truth was safe to deliver to which audience. They gave what they could give. They protected what needed protecting. What she described directly was the consequence: the pregnancy that came, and the plantation owner's decision to sell her again, this time at another auction in a nearby town. She described standing in that auction yard for the second time in her life, older but no less terrified, carrying inside her body the evidence of what had been done to her, waiting to discover which direction her life would be forced to take next. She was purchased again, taken to another plantation. The specifics of what followed are fragmented in the record, but what survives in her testimony is something more durable than specific details. It is the account of what it cost to be a black woman in the antebellum South. Not just the physical cost, though that was enormous. The cost to the interior life, the cost to the self, the sustained effort required to remain in some meaningful sense a person inside a system that had decided you were not one. There is a specific quality of dread reserved for the anticipated return of harm. It is different from the fear of a threat that is unknown or unpredictable. It is worse in some respects, because it has the full weight of previous experience behind it. Because the body already knows what is coming and has no mechanism for avoiding the knowledge. It is the dread that accumulates in the period between the recognition of the threat and the moment of its arrival. The time when you can see the carriage coming down the road and you cannot look away and you cannot run, and all you can do is stand in the kitchen doorway and watch it come. On a large cotton plantation in Alabama, this particular quality of dread was attached to one specific carriage, the dark wheels, the two horses. The distinctive silhouette that became visible along the main road as it approached the estate from the direction of the county seat. The doctor's carriage. Doctors in the antebellum South occupied a position in the plantation world that was economically and socially complex. They were professionals in an era when professional status carried considerable social weight. They were respected guests at the plantation houses. They visited, offered the hospitality of the dining room and the guest room as a matter of social protocol, and they moved through the plantation economy with a freedom of motion that most people in that world did not possess. They traveled between estates, staying overnight when the distance was too great for a single day's journey, accepted into the domestic interior of the plantation house as a trusted figure whose presence was always welcome. What that trusted status meant in practice for the enslaved women working inside those houses was another form of the exposure that every aspect of the plantation world seemed designed to maximize. The testimony from the Alabama plantation, preserved through the Federal Writers Project, came from an older woman who had worked as a cook on the estate for many years. She described the pattern of the doctor's visits with the precision of someone who had watched it unfold so many times that its sequence had become as familiar as the rhythm of the seasons. The carriage appearing on the road in the late afternoon, the word spreading quickly through the plantation. As words always spread in the communities of the enslaved, who had developed systems of communication so efficient and so invisible to the white household that information traveled through those networks faster than most people running it could have managed. The doctor's coming. For most of the plantation, this announcement meant a routine disruption. The household would be activated to receive a guest. Rooms prepared, food cooked, the formal protocols of plantation hospitality enacted. But for one young maid working inside the house, the announcement meant something entirely different. The cook described watching the girl's face change when she heard the news. The shoulders that dropped slightly, as if a weight had settled onto them. The hands that became less steady in their work. The cook knew what the visits meant for the girl. She had seen the pattern establish itself from the first time the doctor had stayed overnight at the plantation, and the owner had sent the maid to attend him in the guest room. She had seen the maid return in the morning with the expression that all these women learned to wear. The face that communicated nothing while the person behind it processed everything. She had placed her hand on the girl's arm in the morning. The gesture of witness that was the most the cook could offer within the constraints of the world they shared. The visits continued. They became as patterns in the plantation. World tended to become regular and expected. The doctor arrived. He was given dinner and whiskey and conversation. Late in the evening, the owner gave the instruction: send the girl. And in the morning the girl returned. What the cook described most powerfully was not any single night, but the accumulation of nights. The way the knowledge that the doctor would return sat inside the maid between his visits. The sight of his carriage on the road, visible from the kitchen window, produced a physical response that the cook could observe from across the room without the girl saying a word. The certainty of what was coming was in some respects worse than the event itself, because at least during the event there was no time left for anticipation. She said that after slavery ended, and she had moved to a new life in another community, she sometimes thought about the girl and wondered what had become of her. She did not know. The records did not know. The Federal Writers Project did not find her. She had passed into the silence that absorbed most of the people who moved through the plantation houses of the antebellum South. Their experience real, their suffering real, their existence real, but their names and their stories erased by a world that had decided their documentation was not worth preserving. The rivers of the American South were the arteries of the antebellum economy. Before the railroads arrived, before roads were improved enough to carry heavy freight reliably, the rivers did the work. The Mississippi, the Alabama, the Arkansas, the Savannah, the James. These waterways moved cotton from plantations to markets, carried goods from urban centers into the rural interior, and provided the primary routes of travel for the men who conducted the commercial business of the slave economy. River traders were among the most mobile figures in this world. They traveled constantly, their boats loaded with goods of all kinds, stopping at plantations along the banks to conduct transactions that might take an afternoon or an entire day. When the distance between stops was too great for a single day's travel, they required overnight accommodation. The plantations that sat near the river provided it. A guest house near the bank or a room inside the main house was a standard feature of any plantation that did business along the water routes. And the men who ran those plantations understood something about hospitality that had nothing to do with genuine generosity and everything to do with the commercial relationships that their economic survival depended on. A trader who was made comfortable during his overnight stay was a trader more likely to return. A trader who was offered not just a room and a meal, but the full range of the plantation's resources was a traitor who left with a favorable impression of his host. And in the world of the antebellum South, the full range of the plantation's resources included its enslaved population. The testimony from the Arkansas River Plantation is in some respects the most clinical of all the accounts that have survived. And that clinical quality makes it paradoxically among the most disturbing. The cook who described these events spoke about them with the matter of act clarity of someone who had processed what she witnessed over 70 years and arrived at a place beyond outrage. A place of simply knowing what was true and determining to say it plainly. Boats would arrive along the riverbank in the late afternoon. The traders would come to the house to conduct their business with the owner. After the transactions were complete, he would invite them to stay for dinner and remain overnight. The cook would prepare the meal. The servants would clear the table and refill the glasses. And when the dinner ended and the traders prepared to move to the guest house near the water, the owner would turn to the house servants and deliver the instructions she had heard so many times. Send 2 of the girls to the guest house. Make sure the traders are comfortable tonight. 2, not 1. 2. The addition of that number communicates something about the scale and the normality of the practice. This was not an occasional event born of unusual circumstances. It was a routine offering. It was hospitality. It was part of how this plantation conducted its business relationships with the men who traveled the river and needed a place to stop. The cook described watching the 2 young women walk down the path toward the guest house carrying small lanterns. The path went through tall grass and trees before reaching the water. From the plantation yard. Their lanterns were visible as small points of moving light in the darkness, growing smaller as they moved away from the house until they reached the guest house door and disappeared inside. She described sitting awake in the servant quarters that night, as she often did when this happened, listening to the river. The sound of water against the banks, the distant creak of the boats tied along the shore, the sound of the men's voices inside the guest house, carrying faintly across the water, then eventually going quiet. The long silence of the night, and then, when the sky began to lighten before dawn, the two small lanterns moving back along the path toward the plantation house, growing larger as they approached, until the two women stepped back into the yard and began preparing for another day of work. No one asked what had happened. No one acknowledged that anything had happened. The traders had their breakfast and conducted any remaining business and departed down the river. The plantation continued its operations. The cook continued her work, and the two women who had walked down to the guest house the previous night continued theirs. The cook said she had thought for many years about whether she should have done something different, whether there was a choice available to her that she had not seen at the time. She always arrived at the same answer. There was no choice available that did not carry a cost greater than the one they were already paying. The plantation owner had total authority. The law provided no recourse. The social world surrounding them offered no ally. The best that could be done, and she had done it, was to be present, to wait awake, to be there when they returned, to let them know through that act of waiting that they had not been forgotten. History, and particularly the history of oppression, has a tendency to record the dramatic forms of resistance and to overlook or render invisible the forms that operated below the threshold of the dramatic. It records the revolts. It records the runaways who reached the north. It records the instances where enslaved people struck back with visible, legible force. What it records far less reliably is the resistance that happened in whispers, the resistance of presence, the resistance of witness, the resistance of survival. And yet, within the testimony of the women and men who described what happened inside the plantation houses, when guests arrived, the evidence of this quieter resistance appears everywhere. Not as heroism in the Hollywood sense of the word, as something more human and more honest, as the effort to preserve under conditions designed to make preservation impossible the interior life that slavery could surveil and punish, but could not fully enter. The older women who warned the younger ones, the cooks who stayed awake waiting for the women to return from the guest rooms, the friends who sat beside each other in silence in the servant quarters, offering the company of another human being as the only comfort available. The whispered names they gave to the places of danger, the guest room of sorrow spoken quietly passed from one person to the next, carrying within those 4 words the entire weight of what had happened there. The insistence on naming what the Shash official vocabulary refused to acknowledge. Harriet Jacobs, whose resistance was perhaps the most documented and the most dramatic, described a form of resistance that she chose because it was the only one available to her that might actually work. She created a situation that removed her from her enslavers, reached by removing herself entirely from the world. The crawl space above her grandmother's house. 7 years of that darkness chosen over the alternative. That choice, made in full knowledge of its costs, was an act of resistance. It was also an act of resistance to the narrative that slavery's supporters constructed about enslaved people. The narrative that claimed they were passive, accepting, incapable of the kind of sustained strategic thinking and fierce self-determination that Jacob's 7 years in that crawl space represents. Other women found other forms. Some formed relationships with other enslaved men that provided a measure of protection through the plantation owner's calculation that disrupting those relationships would cause more inconvenience than it was worth. Some sought favor from the mistress of the house, creating a proximity that functioned as an imperfect shield against the worst of what the master might otherwise arrange. Some pretended illness when guests arrived. Some became indispensable to the domestic operations of the household in ways that made their absence from their assigned duties conspicuous enough to reduce the frequency with which they were chosen. None of these strategies was fully effective. None of them removed the danger. All of them represent the exercise of intelligence and agency in a situation designed to eliminate both. The women who deployed them were not passive. They were navigating an impossible terrain with whatever tools were available to them. And they were doing so with a sophistication and a tenacity that the official history of slavery, with its focus on the dramatic and the visible, has chronically under-recognized. The testimonies collected by the Federal Writers Project preserve these strategies in fragments. In the cook who placed her hand on the girl's arm, in the older woman who warned the new arrival to stay near the kitchen, in the women who waited awake, in the quiet community of witness that formed itself around the suffering of the most vulnerable, offering what it could offer, which was not protection, but was presence, which is not nothing. In a world that had decided these women did not matter, the insistence of the people around them that they did was itself a form of resistance. Small, insufficient, essential. When we ask why the history that we have been exploring tonight was buried for so long, why it appeared so rarely in official accounts of plantation life, why it required the courage of Harriet Jacobs and the elderly testimonies of former enslaved people collected by the Federal Writers Project to enter the historical record at all. We are asking a question that has a precise and unsatisfying answer. It was buried because the people who controlled the production of history did not want it found. The antebellum South constructed a narrative about itself that required as its foundation the denial of the full humanity of the people it enslaved. This was not accidental. It was a philosophical and legal necessity. A society that enslaves human beings for profit can only sustain that practice if it is able to maintain the fiction that the beings it enslaves are not fully human, that they do not feel what other human beings feel, that their suffering is not the same suffering that other human beings recognize as suffering, that their interior lives are not in any meaningful sense interior lives. This fiction required constant maintenance. Every act of enslaved resistance, every testimony of enslaved intelligence and dignity and feeling, every documented instance of enslaved people loving their children, protecting each other, building communities and cultures and spiritual lives within the constraints of their bondage, was a threat to the fiction. And threats to the fiction were managed in the most direct way available. They were suppressed. Stories were not told. Documents were not preserved. Testimonies were not recorded. And when they were recorded, as in the case of Harriet Jacobs, they were dismissed, doubted, challenged, their author's credibility attacked. The specific suppression of the history of sexual exploitation within the plantation household served an additional function beyond the general denial of enslaved humanity. It protected the reputations, the marriages, the social standing, and the legal interests of the specific men who had participated in that exploitation. Many of those men had white families who were dependent on those reputations. Many had political careers business interests, and social positions that the truth of their behavior would have jeopardized. And many of them were still alive and still powerful long after slavery ended in a society that had decided through the failures of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow that the full reckoning with what had happened would not occur. The silence was not passive, it was enforced. The women who had survived these experiences found themselves, after emancipation, in a world that offered them freedom in name, but continued to surround them with the social and economic power of the men who had exploited them, and the families and institutions that had benefited from that exploitation. Speaking the truth in that world carried consequences. The silence was maintained not by the women who had experienced these events, but by the structures that made speaking dangerous. And so the testimonies waited. They waited in the memories of elderly women and men who had been children during slavery. They waited until the 1930s, when interviewers from the Federal Writers Project traveled across the South and sat down with people who were in their 80s and 90s, and finally had the opportunity, at the end of their lives, to say what they had witnessed. By then, many of the people most directly affected were gone. The women themselves, the ones who had walked those hallways, who had returned before dawn to begin another day of work. Most of them had lived their entire lives without the world ever acknowledging what had been done to them. What remains is what they chose to leave. The testimonies, the memoirs, the whispered names that passed through the slave quarters and eventually passed through history. The guest room of sorrow, the sound of carriage wheels on a dirt road, the small lanterns moving through the grass toward the river. There is a question that must be asked at the end of a story like this one, and it deserves a more honest answer than the comfortable ones that are sometimes offered in its place. The question is this: what do we owe to the people whose stories we have just heard? The easy answer, the one that allows the audience to leave with their conscience satisfied, is that we owe them remembrance. That by listening to these stories, by bearing witness to what happened in those plantation houses, we have fulfilled some obligation to the dead, that the act of knowing is itself sufficient tribute. But the harder answer, the one that these women's testimonies actually demand, if we are reading them with the attention they deserve, is that remembrance is not enough. It is the beginning of an obligation, not the end of one. The history we have explored tonight did not end when slavery ended. The specific exploitation of black women's bodies within the plantation system was a practice embedded in a broader set of social, legal, and economic arrangements. Those arrangements did not disappear with emancipation. They transformed. The legal protections that were supposed to replace slavery's total denial of personhood were undermined systematically through the decades that followed Reconstruction. The economic conditions that maintained black women's vulnerability to exploitation were reconstituted through Jim Crow, through sharecropping systems that reproduced many of the dynamics of plantation labor, through the deliberate exclusion of black workers from the labor protections and social insurance programs that the New Deal constructed for the rest of the working population. The women who finally spoke to Federal Writers Project interviewers in the 1930s were speaking from a world that had not, in the ways that mattered most to their daily lives, actually changed as much as the official narrative of American progress claimed. They were speaking from poverty mostly, from communities still shaped by the long shadow of the system that had produced their memories, from lives in which freedom was real, but its material conditions were constrained by exactly the same concentrations of power that had constrained their grandmothers. To remember them in the fullest sense of that word requires more than knowing their stories. It requires taking seriously the questions their stories raise about how power operates, about who is protected and who is exposed by the systems we inhabit, about what it means when the most vulnerable people in a society are asked to absorb the costs of its worst impulses in silence, and then denied even the acknowledgement of what they have absorbed. The women who walked those hallways do not need our pity. They were not pitiful. They were extraordinary in the specific and demanding sense that they survived with their interior lives and their human dignity intact, conditions designed to destroy both. What they deserve from us is not the softening comfort of pity, but the harder, more demanding gift of genuine understanding. Understanding that what was done to them was wrong. Understanding who did it and who benefited. Understanding that the silence that surrounded it was not a natural silence, but a manufactured one, maintained by the deliberate choices of people with power. And understanding that manufactured silences can be unmade, that the voices buried beneath them can be recovered, and that the recovery of those voices is not a sentimental act, but a political one. That is what we do on Shadows of Black History. We unmake the manufactured silence. We recover the voices. We name the rooms that carried names no official document preserved. We listen to the sound of carriage wheels on a dirt road, and we refuse to pretend we do not know what it means. The women of the plantation houses lived in a world that tried to erase them. They endured that world, most of them, without the luxury of leaving any record behind. The records that exist, we have explored together tonight, and they are enough to know that these women were here, that they thought and felt and suffered and resisted and endured, that they cared for each other in the small ways that were all that were available to them, that they waited awake through long nights for the women who had been sent to the guest rooms, that they placed their hands on each other's arms in the morning. That is not nothing. That is everything. And the least we can do from the distance of 3 centuries and the relative safety of our own lives is to hear them. You have just heard the voices that the official history of America worked for 200 years to keep silent. The women of the plantation houses, the cooks and the maids and the young girls who carried candles down hallways they did not want to enter. The women who waited awake. The women who placed their hands on each other's arms. The women who named the rooms that official documents refused to name. Their stories are not comfortable. They were never meant to be comfortable. They are meant to be true. And on Shadows of Black History, truth is the only thing we are interested in. If this story reached you tonight, if it opened something, and if it gave you a name or a face for a part of history that had previously been only abstraction, then do something with that. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not just people who already know this history, people who don't. People who were taught a version of the antebellum South, in which the plantation house was a place of elegance and order and nothing more complicated than that. Show them what the elegance was built on. Leave us a comment below. Tell us which part of the story stayed with you. Tell us what questions it raised for you. Tell us where you are in the world tonight. We read every comment. We see every person in this community from across this globe, and every single one of you choosing to spend your time with these forgotten voices is an act of witness that matters. Subscribe to Shadows of Black History. Turn on your notifications because we are not finished. The archive of buried Black history is vast, and we are only at its edges. There are more names, more rooms, more testimonies waiting to be heard by an audience willing to listen without looking away. Until our next story, remember this. The most powerful thing a witness can do is refuse to pretend they did not see. These women showed us what they endured. The least we can do is see it clearly. We will keep bringing you the stories they never wanted you to,